So today's project in the shop is a 2001 Boxster S, and this car came in because it was having some suspension issues, mainly some noise. But the car has aftermarket springs installed that are really, really low. Now the suspension measurement on these cars is taken from underneath, and you measure from a particular point to the ground. And when I measured this car before we lifted it up, it was measuring about 80 millimeters clearance, when it should be 132 to 152. So this is creating a bunch of other problems that we are going to try and rectify today with changing struts, changing springs. We're also going to be doing some brake work underneath the car and a couple of suspension components. So I've got the car sitting on the ground before we do any work, and this is not the place to measure ride height, but we're just going to use it because it's easy to see. So right now this fender is 633 millimeters off the ground. So after we've gone through and done all of our work, we're going to just retake that measurement. As I said, it's not a good spot to measure ride height, but it's just going to give us an indication of how far the car is lifted. So vehicle ride height has a lot of influence over a lot of things. Handling of the car, from impact stuff, and underneath this car we can kind of see what's going on. The whole front of this car has literally been scraped off. We've got plastic pieces that are supposed to be here that are just knocked out. Scrapes on the front. Now these cars are low to begin with, so some of this scraping is okay. But this car is so low that when we drive it in our driveway, and we do not have a steep driveway, the car actually high centers, which means that it drags its belly right in the middle of the car. So we really want to make sure that our ride heights are sensible. They also play a large factor in how the suspension works and the suspension geometry. And it will especially play a large part on tire wear. So for tire wear, you can see that this tire is just scrubbed. We've still got reasonable tread on the outside. There's our wear mark. By the time we get to the inside edge, this is just wiped and gone. Now there's two factors that can cause that. Camber is one of those factors. The other one would be excessive toe out. When I measured the camber on the wheels before I lifted it, this car is well outside its factory specifications. And for that, it is actually having the wheels leaning in. Now, this is one of the side effects of lowering a vehicle, because as the suspension moves up into the wheel well, the camber will move inwards towards the center of the car, and that's by design. So when we lower a vehicle, we end up with excessive camber numbers. Now, another thing to look for, we are going to be going ahead and replacing front and rear struts and springs. But if you're just doing general service on your car, when you see stuff like this is oil leaking out of the shock. And up under here, if I lift the boot up, I can also see where it is quite wet with oil. Now this is something that you would keep an eye out on service when you start to see things like this. This is indicating that this part is going to need to be changed fairly soon. So for those of you that know normally how you would disassemble this with compressing a spring and using a spring compressor to do so, I want to show you how weak these springs are. So if I grab this spring, I can literally pull it off its seat. So that's how soft a spring is in here. I can hold that down with one hand and undo the nut on top, whereas normally I'd have to have that in a spring compressor. So hopefully our new set of springs is going to bring this car up to the 030 spec, which is Porsche's 130 millimeter ride height, their sport suspension height, and solve a lot of our issues. So another job that we're going to be doing on the left side front of the car is we're going to be changing our lower control arm. And this is because our ball joint rubber right here has split. Now the ball joint is a sealed unit, can't be changed by itself. It means you got to replace this entire arm. The other thing that this is doing, we are in a dusty area, and it's got a lot of debris into the ball joint already, and when the car is on the ground and you turn the wheel or you go over a bump, it makes a very annoying sound. So we're going to be replacing this part as well. One of the other things that we're going to be changing is our drop links. Now, the drop link hasn't completely failed. The symptoms on these when they do fail is it will make a clunking sound when you go over bumps. These have a ball joint in here. They are sealed for life. And this car is at that age right now where the rubber is breaking down. So that boot has split, even though the drop link hasn't failed yet. Because we're revamping the whole suspension, it's really now's the time to do it. It's got to become coming off anyways, and they're a pretty cheap and inexpensive part. So we're going to replace those on both sides to try and really bring this suspension back to where it needs to be. So today we're going to go ahead and remove and replace a front strut. Now on this job you can do it without pulling the brakes down. I've taken the brakes off just to make the strut a little bit easier for me to handle and the hub. If you don't know how to do that, we have a separate video on how to remove and replace your brakes, and you might want to take a look at that one. So this is our front strut assembly right here. It's connected to our front hub assembly. There's a pinch bolt right here. I'm actually going to take the entire hub out. It just makes it a little bit easier. Plus I also need to do a repair. There's a broken bolt from one of the brake line holders that I need to repair, and that's going to be a lot easier to do on the bench than in the car. Some of the stuff I'm going to take off, you can get around without doing it. I'm going to pull this heat shield off, for example, only because to get my ball joint tool in, I've got to bend this. There's not a lot of room, and it's a lot of work to straighten it. So it is up to you if you want to take off all of these pieces or work around some of them. Next, I'm going to unplug my ABS sensor, pull out our 10mm right there. And then this clips into the actual strut. It's with a rubber mount. These can be a little challenging to get out sometimes, just because the rubber is a little bit older and stiffer. So I just kind of gently try to pry it out without damaging anything, like that. And I'm just going to peel it over to the side, let it hang down. So I'm going to take off my tie rod. This is an 18mm nut. This one was actually pretty loose, a lot looser than I would have liked to have seen it. Next, I'm going to disconnect this. I've taken the nut off. I'm going to use a ball joint puller. This is so I don't damage my tie rod end, because I'm planning on reusing it. Just pops it out so it's out of the way. So the first thing I'm going to take out underneath the car is going to be our strut here. There is a mounting bolt here. I'm going to loosen up these other 3 bolts. I do not need to take these 3 out, just loosen that and undo a bolt here. That's going to allow me to pull this front torsion arm out, or strut. Then I'm going to remove the bolt right here. This is for our lower control arm. I don't need to remove the ball joint. I'm not replacing the arm, so it can just stay there. And this is going to allow me to drop this entire assembly down and out of my way. So next, I'm just going to undo my bolt from my lower control arm. That's going to just pull down and hang to the side. So the last thing I'm going to undo is going to be my strut for my sway bar, which comes down here. This is also my pinch bolt. Right now I've left that tight just because I'm working underneath this hub. I don't want it to fall on my head. So I'm going to undo here, and then we'll bring the car down and I'll undo up there. So now I'm going to undo my drop link bolt, which goes all the way through. You can see how much easier it is to work on. I can just turn this all the way. Then I'll need a wrench. There's a little flat nut back here that we've got to get in to back it up. Pull the bolt and I'm supporting the weight. Hub's just going to slide down off the bottom. And we can also see right here we've got our broken bolt that we need to set up and drill that out. We'll do that on the mill. So this is one of those ancillary parts that we'll be changing as part of the job. This is old enough now to where the rubber has rotten and it's all split and broken out. This one is also really loose. The effect that this will have on the car is it'll give you a clunk sound when you go over bumps, and that's because dirt and grime can get in there, wear out this ball joint and make them really loose and floppy like that. They should be relatively stiff. So we're going to be putting new ones on. They're relatively inexpensive, about $40 for a drop link, and might as well change it. You're taking it off anyway. So the last thing I have is 3 bolts up on top. So I'm going to drop the car down so we can access those, and then the strut will come right out. The last 3 nuts are these ones up here. These also control the camber setting for the car. We will be doing an alignment after we finish changing out the struts. So I'm just going to grab my ratchet. And the way that I will do these is I'll take usually the front 2 just until the locking portion of the nut is unlocked, and I can twist them with my fingers, but I won't take them all the way out. The one furthest back, I'm go ahead and take it all the way out. And then I'm going to have to reach through with my hand and hold the strut up before I take the other nuts out. And then just slide our strut assembly out. So the springs that are installed in this are lowered springs and are really soft. I can compress them just with my own hands. I mean, I showed you in the car that I could squeeze the springs together. So if you're doing this and it's a stock spring, then you need to be in a spring compressor that's going to compress this while you undo the tops. I'm going to go ahead and just undo it here on the ground because I just push it down and hold that spring weight. I'm going to crack the nut loose using my impact gun first, and then I'll have to put a 7mm Allen socket into the strut to hold it, stop it spinning. Okay. And then I'm going to have to use a wrench and a socket to get the rest of it. So now I'm just going to undo the rest of that nut. I've got to support it in the center. So as I said before, if you can't hold this thing down, don't attempt to undo this nut because it'll come off with a high amount of spring force and can cause a lot of damage. Okay, so there's just a couple of pieces that I need out of this, the washers, the top plate, and the rest of this is pretty much done. Our bump stop has pretty much been grenaded. Our boot is totally compacted, so we're going to put all new stuff on the new strut. Parts I always change. This is between the top bushing and the spring, and it is an actual bearing. This is what allows the strut to rotate, so when you turn the wheel, the strut is actually turning and the spring pressure's up against here. So we always want to install a new one just to make sure that when everything goes back together, everything's nice and smooth and operates the way it should do. So before we reuse our top mounting bushing, you want to have a good look around, especially down in these areas. Make sure there's no stress fractures starting to happen. Make sure this part is nice and tight and doesn't move around. This is what secures the top of the strut to the vehicle. So if there's any kind of movement here, if this rubber looks like it's breaking down, you want to replace these. So we've got our new Bilstein strut that I'm going to install. These are specific to the M030 strut, or suspension, sorry. This is because we are putting lower than original springs into the car. This strut is designed to operate with those lower springs without bottoming the strut out and damaging the valving or damaging the strut. So firstly, take the new nut, and there's a little spacer right here. Got my new dust boot and bump stop. Gonna put that on. Then my spacer has to go back on. This is tapered. It's also tapered where it sits here. So you want to make sure you put it on the right way. So that's going to come down like that. Now we're ready to put our new spring and the rest of our steering components. So when I put my spring on, I want to make sure that the bottom part of the spring locates against the stop. My steering bearing with its rubber mount is going to come in and locate there. I want to make sure that the bottom bump stop washer is installed. Drop it down. And we're going to take our top piece like that. And lastly, our washer. Now, for a stock ride height springs, you won't be able to compress it. So you'll need to use a spring compressor. So once I've got it on and my nut started, just got to tighten the nut all the way down.
Makes it a one-time use nut.
Yes, it is one-time use. These are, like any lock nut, you need to replace them each time. Okay, the last thing I need to do is grab my torque wrench and torque this down. So this nut needs to be torqued to 72 Newton meters. So on the top of the strut, you'll see two arrows. These arrows are front and back on the car, so it's a wider stance here. So when we come up in our bolt holes, we have a wider stance right here, and the third one's back. So all I want to do is bring my strut under, slide it up through, and just get our nut started back onto that strut. Now it doesn't matter the position of the bottom strut right now, because this is a steering strut. It can rotate and move on that bearing assembly without affecting the spring placement. So once I've got those in, you can tighten them up now. I generally leave them loose just so I can get the rest of the car assembled and come back and tighten them last. So the assembly is the reverse of the disassembly. Now I want to show you here, see how the strut will easily turn, and our spring is turning on our bearing there, so it's not disturbing any of our spring location. So that's why we don't have to worry about it when we're sliding it up in there. I've repaired the thread in our hub. So now all I should be able to do is slide it up and slide my bolt through. The bolt's going to slide through from the back side. Now the other thing I usually like to do, there's a little stop right here. When I tighten this and nip it down, I generally try and lift it up against that when I nip it down, just because eventually when the car's weighed it'll push down, but I want to start with it sitting up against the stop. But if you need to walk away, you can let it hang, it's not going to fall out. I use new lock nuts even if you're not replacing these pieces. So it's going to get that started. My lock nut started on the bottom, and then I'll go ahead and tighten it. So I'm just going to bring my nut down until it's a little bit closer, because I still want to make sure I lift the hub up. Okay, the hub's not going to go anywhere. Nip that down. So we're going to go ahead and torque this. This is going to torque at 50 Newton meters. I'm going to swing my arm. Locate that. Locate our steering. Okay. Sometimes the arm will fall out, no big deal. When it comes to tightening a tie rod, because it's got a taper, you're going to have to squeeze this up, otherwise the shaft is just going to spin because it is a lock nut. Yep. And this one, the lock nut is so tight that it won't even let me do it, so I'm going to have to support it in the top. So in most of these ball joints on these cars now, whether it's tie rod or main, there's a Torx head cut into the top. So you can put a socket and a ratchet in there to pull the joint into the tapered fit. There we go. Bring that up and we'll torque it in just a minute. Our tie rod end to 65 Newton meters. Alright, so just going to push my arm back up, and we're just going to have to line it up to get our bolts in. Okay, we're going to put our strut brace back in. So I'm just going to put my backing plate back together. So I'm going to bring my wiring connection back around. This is going to lock into the strut again. Plug our ABS sensor back in. We still got to leave this for our brake sensor. These are what controls our wheel alignment settings, and because we've changed everything, we need to redo a wheel alignment anyway. So I'm not too concerned where these tighten down right now. Generally I'll put them somewhere in the middle, but I'm just going to screw these down. I'm not even going to worry about torquing these right now because I do need to align it. I just want to nip them down into position, just so when the vehicle weight comes onto it, it doesn't move around. So that's it for the strut replacement. We're just going to repeat the same procedure on the other side. Pretty straightforward job. We've got to go ahead and put our brakes back together. We've covered that in our brake video, so check out that video if you haven't watched it already. So with the brakes out of the way, we're going to work on removing the strut. I'm going to start with ABS wire connection and brake warning wire connections just to get it off the hub. The hub does need to move this direction and down to clear the strut, not as much as the front, and generally I don't typically completely remove it like I do on the front. So I'm just going to start back here, undo this 6mm bolt. Then I'm going to unplug my ABS sensor. Now this is connected to the strut right here. There's two rubber grommets that need to be pressed out of the strut. And then I'm just going to put this over here and let it dangle out of the way. Okay, so similar to the front, we need to be able to drop the hub down. So we need to release some of the suspension components. First one I'm going to pull off is my tie rod end. Now this is what controls the rear toe on the vehicle, and it's adjustable back here. We are going to be resetting our four-wheel alignment after this job, but anytime you release these bolts right here or make any changes, the car needs to be re-wheel aligned. My puller on so we don't damage the boot or the joint. And it looks like this boot has split right here in a couple of places. So we might have to put another arm on here. The joint still feels fairly tight. Just going to undo our drop link. Pull that out, make sure there's no movement or play in these, and the boot still looks like it's in good shape. Okay, I'm going to pull this ball joint nut right here. So I've just popped the ball joint here, undid the nut, and let the ball joint pop out. To break this connection without damaging the boot, we don't want to drive a pickle fork in through here. So I just used a large pry bar, put some pressure on there, and then hit the hub to shock it and allow it to pop. And that's moving my hub out. So now I can undo the last bolt on the drop down link. That'll release the strut. I can get the hub out of my way and get the strut out. So I'm loosening up the bolts on my control arms. Now, these bolts control the rear wheel alignment. So anytime that you loosen these up and move these bolts, whether it's this one or this one, these are adjusters, you will need to plan on having the car realigned. So the last thing that's holding the hub to the strut is our drop link. And I'm just going to pull that out, and we can see we're already moving down off our strut. So I'm just going to use my plastic mallet. There we go. So I'm just going to let my hub sit there on my axle. If you want to pull this whole assembly out, you'd need to disconnect the axle at the transmission, as well as your parking brake cable to get this entire hub out. So now all I got left to do is undo the mounting bolts on the top, and the strut's ready to come out. The first thing I need to do to access the top strut mounts is get my roof cover up. And so to do that, you would follow the standard operation, ignition position 1, put the parking brake on, unlock the roof and open it just enough so it pops up the rear cover. Now the bolts for the top strut, you have one that's going to be under this little rubber plug. So I'm going to pull that out. We're going to access right down there. And then the other two are going to be under here. So I'm going to grab a screwdriver, pull out this clip, and this one here is a little plastic screw, so I can fold this out, and my other two bolts will be right here. Just want to carefully pull it back, and then you can see there's one of the bolts right there. The other one's going to be round underneath. You kind of got to feel around for it. These are going to be a 13mm nut. So I'm on the back bolt right now, and then the other bolt is going to be right under the carpet trim right here. So when it comes to undoing these, what I do is I take the back one and the one under this little plug out, and I leave this one for last, because this one I can access fairly easily. And these are lock nuts. So I'm just going to get it to where it's loose enough for me to turn with my fingers, and then I'm going to reach under the car and grab a hold of the strut so it doesn't fall on my foot, and undo the last nut. So I'm just going to crack the lock nut first, and then before I release this one I need to put my spring compressors to take up the spring load. So my spring's loose, so now I can undo the nut. You got to be careful with your spring because it's basically loaded. So you just got to make sure that you carefully take your spring compressors off. And on this rear strut you can see it's been losing a lot of oil out of it. It's all wet and doesn't feel too horrible just yet. Pretty easy to compress though. So we've got our new Bilstein strut. We've just got to assemble it, put our new spring onto it. Also have a new top plate. They've changed the way that the body seal works on these. Instead of having a round seal like this one that breaks and comes apart, that actually has a body seal here to seal the body. This is a wet location. This top bushing is also what controls the position of the strut, and these do wear out on a regular basis, so it's a good idea to change them. So I've got my boot, new bump stop. I'm just going to slide that over onto our strut. Going to grab our washer, followed by the spring, which has got to lock into this point. And we've got our top spring mount. Now these little keys have to locate in on the studs. And so I'm just going to check and make sure that this part here is indexed correctly based on what the car is. And I'm going to line it up with this fin on the strut. Because unlike in the front, this is not a bearing, so this strut, if I turn it, it's very hard to turn once spring pressure is on. And we're also going to compress this spring so we can put our top plate on and line everything up. So when I install this, you can see how the bolt pattern is spread out here. And we have a large spacing here and a shorter spacing between these two distances. This short space stud has to face our fin on our strut when we assemble it. Okay, so now all I got to do is compress the spring. We're all assembled up and ready to go back into the car. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to slide it up and I'm going to put one nut on. Same one that I took out last, I'm going to put on first, which is this one right here. It's going to come through this little hole right there, and then I'm going to leave it loose. When it comes to putting the last nut on, I'm just going to take a little bit of grease just to help hold it in my socket, because you can't really get your hand around to hold this and support it. So I'm going to leave that loose so my strut can move around. That's going to make it easier for me to slide my hub up and in so I can connect everything back up. If I'm tight, this is going to be sticking out right here. It's going to have no angle movement. And then we'll come back and tighten those after we've connected the hub. So now I've just got to get these two pieces lined up. And we can see here that we've got a little bit of angle disparity. This is why I leave the struts loose at the top. Just want to find that sweet spot and push it up just like that. So if that strut was tight, it wouldn't allow me to move around like I did. Once I'm lifted up, take my through bolt, then I can go ahead and put my nut on. When I tighten this, I want to lift this hub up so it's hard up against that strut again, just like we did on the front. And we can go ahead and torque this nut. And these are torqued at 85 Newton meters. So now I can go and snap my wiring clips back into the strut and install my bracket over here. Just a single bolt, plug my ABS sensor back in. So before I reconnect my lower ball joint, I'm just cleaning it all off. Just in case there was some debris that we got onto it, we've contaminated it. We want to make sure when it comes up in here, this hole in here is also nice and clean. No oil, no grease, no dirt. So I'm just going to clean it with some brake clean. And then make sure, I'm just going to wipe around with my finger, make sure it feels good up in there. So you have to push the hub back over to get the ball joint to align, and then I'm going to put my nut back on and tighten it up. Now, one of the issues that you may have is this ball joint may spin in this housing because this is a lock nut, and in which case what I'm going to do is I'll take my jack, I'll bring the car down, I'll put pressure under here to push it up, force it into that tapered fitting, and that'll stop it from spinning. Okay, we're just going to torque our sway bar drop link. So a couple of things that I have still left loose are back here on our control arms. I've left these bolts right here where they come through this structural member. I've just cracked those nuts. And I've also got my camber bolt loose. It's not loose, but it is definitely not suspension ready to drive tight. This is because I'm going to be doing a wheel alignment, and these need to be moved and adjusted. The last thing we have to do to tighten the strut in is tighten our top bolts. I'll bring the car down, do that now, because these are fixed on the rear. Our camber adjustment, unlike on the front that happens at the top of the strut, happens on this lower control arm right here. There is a camber bolt right here, and this will physically move this arm back and forth, which will change the camber settings. The toe settings on the front are done on the steering rack, whereas on the back they are done from this tie rod arm here that's a fixed arm. But in this bolt hole here, you can see it's a slotted hole, and that allows you to move this arm back and forth to adjust the rear toe. So I do leave those items loose until it's down and on my alignment table. I'm just going to reassemble the brakes, adjust parking brakes, new pads, and flush the system. You can watch that video separately in our brake video, how to change the brakes on a Boxster. So that wraps it up for our Boxster suspension. We'll have the car down on the ground and do the alignment. We'll show you that in a separate video. I'd like to say thanks for watching. Hit the like button if you like it. Hit the subscribe button. It helps us out, helps us move the channel forward. And we'll see you on the next one.